Shakespeare probably wrote King Richard III in 1592 or 1593 as a sequel to his first trilogy of history plays that chronicle the English civil wars between the powerful Lancastrian and Yorkist families. Now, Richard III, as an interesting avant-garde theater subject, will be debated as what he looked like physically. That is a popular debate to have, and so there's a certain profile that he would fit, and if you were to attend a play and he didn't look that way and you were expecting him to, it might be interesting. It might be a night to remember. So the War of the Roses, if you're American, you don't really know what that means, but it, I suppose, culminated when the Earl of Richmond defeated Richard III, and that was after the culmination of England's conflict with France. And so in the timeline, you have to think that the Battle of Bosworth, which was where the Earl of Richmond defeated Richard, is important. And the Battle of Bosworth goes into grave details about where the actual fight took place. It lasted about a half hour, supposedly. And there's not a scene in the Shakespeare's play that covers like the night before the actual battle. And so, since the War of the Roses, what's the War of the Roses? Who is fighting, right? Well, it was, I suppose, the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, and it culminates at Bosworth in the battle. And so you learn that Stoke Golding and Albion Hill were probably circled by the Earl of Richmond, and supposedly Upton Field was where the final blows were laid before before the fight was over. But before it started, supposedly there were some after Richard had prayed the night before, there was some confusion because there were French troops still on the flank, who were while the conflict was over with France, they still had military in England, and so the Earl of Richmond was approaching with his troops. There were French troops on the flank, and one of Richard's men, the Duke of Norfolk, ends up coming in between Lord Stanley and the Earl of Richmond. And since Lord Stanley was still sort of on the fence, and just as in the middle of everything, as even maybe the French troops that still remained, he ended up capturing the Duke of Norfolk. And this is the same time that Richard had already ordered for the beheading of another figure. And so it kind of threw everybody off, and that's why there was confusion at the beginning of it, because of an odd order. You would think praying to just go into battle, you wouldn't then come up with such a strange command, because he couldn't go and be a traitor to the king. He had to accept the order to behead somebody. And it's like, my goodness, we're in a fight. It's like, I have to now make sure to show my loyalty to you as the king. And so a half hour later, the Earl of Richmond had, I suppose, laid the final blows, and then became King Henry VII. And so you have to look at what the tale that is told is basically starting at Act 3. Richard becomes the completely unpopular king. Like you wonder, what is the War of Roses? Who does it lead back to? This King Richard guy, or Richard III, however you'd like to refer to him. I mean, you have to look that he leaves just like a trail of dead people. Like before that final battle, like he kills Lord Hastings, but after he bamboozles the mayor, right, and the citizens, and so prior to that, he goes on a rampage as well, and there's just a a slaughterhouse of people that were killed by him. And what's crazy is the king before him was King Edward IV, and then he kills like the king's son, Prince Edward, and Prince Richard. The Duke of Clarence, named George, was killed by him as well. So it was Queen Elizabeth, who was Edward's wife. Her family was killed by him as well. So there were no longer any heirs to King Edward IV's throne on like his paternal bloodline, if you will, because they were all killed by Richard. And so that's why Shakespeare took such a disliking to him. It was like, you wouldn't want to tell the story, I don't think, favorably. He was able to, because it was 200 years after the Battle of Bosworth, and so he was able to just say that, no, he was pretty much a butcher and killed the whole entire clan, not to mention Lord Hastings, after he had bamboozled like the whole entire political committee. And Buckingham, like they couldn't, he pulled the wool over Buckingham and killed Lord Hastings. And so that was when he then went into battle. And so what I suppose dark person Richard was. And so Shakespeare made sure of that. So you wouldn't look back and say, well, the first king was Richard, because that was where the War of Roses kind of culminated. Because Americans kind of, I think, wonder. That's why we're having a discussion. And I always thought that there might be a room for another scene, because you don't want to. Being American, you don't predict him to be so unlikable until you read the story. And I even can say that just from studying it impartially, like you go into the Battle of Bosworth, just kind of wondering what happens. And I just thought it was, there's just said something weird happened spiritually at the beginning of it even. And that from the strategic point of having troops here, and they're going to flank this side and come through Albion Hill and end up over at Stoke Golding and have it surrounded. So that kind of flushed Richard and whoever was already sitting there, because they weren't on the attack. They were flushed over to Upton Field, and where they then engaged, I suppose. There were probably minor engagements before the end battle, which was my kingdom for a horse. And so that's the fifth act in the Shakespeare play. That's when the actual military conflict comes to a head. By this time, Richard's army and navy are strong, a formidable threat to the bad tyrant. And then it goes on to kind of talk about the night before the battle. Richard awakens. His conscience is racked with guilt and fear. During the Battle of Bosworth, he and Richmond go head-to-head, and Richmond prevails. At one point, Richard loses his horse and is reduced to uttering the now famous line, "My horse! My horse! My kingdom for a horse!" Richard triumphs and becomes the next king, who's known as Henry VII. Richard's nightmare was kind of similar to something that had happened earlier when Clarence, who is King Edward's son, maybe Clarence, is that right? The Duke of Clarence. It was King Edward's brother. So his brother would have been a duke, and that was kind of the beginning of the first evil deeds. It was like when he infiltrated the I suppose the royal court and just slaughtered everybody. And it was he started with Duke of Clarence, sadly, and this was when he wrote in his journal, not his book of hours, the night before the battle, but this was his journal right after he maybe had the Duke killed. Is I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature, dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable the dogs bark at me as I halt by them, while I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away of time, and let's see my shadow in the sun, sat on my own deformity. Therefore I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair spoken days. I am determined to prove a villain. Now that might be like right after he off the Duke, and so he already had like he's like, I'm gonna go kill all those people and be king. Said then he has weird hallucinations the night before his final battle. So it was just, I guess, if you're going to try to leave a trail of the dead behind, it's not going to work out. And so that's kind of what you learn, though. I suppose it's why it's a story that we tell still, because you have to think it took 200 years to get it out there to begin with because of everything. And now we tell it still because, hell, that guy's evil, right? That's not who you would look up to. You just wouldn't. And so I think we all understand that coming out there. And Shakespeare made a point of saying it. He said, I don't really want you to look up to Richard because Richard's pretty bad. And so I said I saw things impartially from the battlefield standpoint, but it's difficult too. I mean, if you want to believe in some of the theater that we passed down, to look at things impartially. He was a pretty evil dude. So once you see that story that took 200 years to put out, you can kind of get the gist of it. That is all for now. All right.